spring pressed against the windows like a cat wanting in. Inside, money cooled the air to a precise degree that made skin forget weather. Crystal stems leaned into light. Knives lined themselves like soldiers. The piano in the corner released a slow ribbon of notes that made the room keep its spine straight and its voice down. Diana Johnson carried plates and absence in equal measure. She had learned which eyes skated and which lingered, and how to step past both. 5 years in this room, and she could steady a wobbling tulip glass with 2 fingers, hear a lie in a wine order, and vanish so completely that people said thank you to the air and believed the air had answered. The marble column near table 12 shone like a verdict. At that table, a boy sat with his knees wrapped in steel. The braces were polished where constant friction polished them, and the leather straps bore the clean wear of use, and the boy kept watching the pianist's left hand like it held a secret the room was trying to forget. "Sir, your water," Diana said at a neighboring table, not looking at the boy, because looking can make people disappear. Still, she felt him, the way dancers feel marks on a floor. His shoulders held the quiet of someone living beside instructions, and his fingers tapped a rhythm against the linen, so small it could have been nerves or defiance, or just a body, remembering it had a say. The melody softened into something that avoided corners. The boy stood. The braces scraped metal against gloss, and the sound cut through talk like a knife through the wrong cake, and every fork hung in midair. The pianist's hands hovering a half-inch above keys, the manager swiveling with a smile that hid a blade. "Sir, control your son." Thornton used volume like a surgeon uses a scalpel, deft, restrained, meant to leave no visible scar. "This is not a dance hall. Our staff aren't here to entertain children." At the table, the father pressed 2 fingers into the linen as if pushing the moment back into shape. His suit sat on him the way an address sits on a building, inevitable, expensive, permanent. "Lucas," he said, voice low enough to sound like care and trained enough to sound like command. "Sit." Lucas didn't sit, not because he wanted to be a problem, because his hand had already lifted toward the woman in black, who was nobody to this room, and therefore safer than everyone in it, toward Diana, the name on her tag pretending to be small, his palm unsteady and open like a question that had waited too long to be asked. Diana could have stepped back. She had the choreography for that. A tilt of the chin, a half-smile, the practiced apology of eyes. Instead, she slid the tray to a stand, smoothed her apron once, and untied it with a motion that looked like a trick she'd rehearsed in the mirror until the knot understood there would be no argument today. "I'm off the clock, Mr. Thornton," she said, even and clear. She folded the apron and set it down as if laying a body out with respect. Then she crossed the short distance to the boy and put her hand in his, not to steady him, not to claim him, but to tell the room she had decided where she would stand. "What do you think you're doing?" the father said, half rising. His tone was trained to travel without moving. Diana met it and let it pass her, like wind. "I'm accepting an invitation," she said. "I can't dance in an apron." The pianist, bless him, slid into a melody with more breath in it and fewer rules. Lucas tugged the first foot forward. The brace squealed, and 2 women at table 7 made matching flinches. They hid by reaching for water. Diana matched the tremble with the simplest thing she owned, patience, her body angled to be available without offering rescue, her breath counting slow in the space behind her teeth. 1, 2, 3. He dragged a toe. He found a patch of floor that didn't lie, and then lost it, and then found it again. His mouth thinned in concentration, then loosened in something like relief, and the room's attention leaned in so hard you could feel chairs recalibrate their weight. "She's getting fired tomorrow," someone whispered, and the sentence traveled like steam. Diana didn't look to see who said it. She watched the boy's eyes and timed her small pivots to his. letting him decide where the next step landed and where the last one had meant to go all along. At the table, the father's face changed the way weather does 1 degree at a time if you weren't looking. All at once if you were. Something crossed it so quickly it could have been a trick of the lights. A memory living room. A cheap rug. A woman laughing, crooked as she spun a toddler who didn't care about rhythm because joy had its own meter. He didn't say her name. That kind of memory doesn't enjoy being called. Lucas took a second step. This one held itself better. The third wasn't pretty, but it belonged to him, and ownership is a sound even a quiet room can hear. Diana turned with him just enough to make the circle feel closed. Then she walked him back. His hand in hers was cooler, steadier, and when she reached the table, she didn't let go until he settled into the chair of his own will. "Thank you for asking me," she told him, formal and true, as if he were a man who'd done something difficult with grace. It was an honor. Only then did she let his hand go. Thornton slid in with a prepared apology, syllables lined up like napkins. "Mr. Montgomery, this won't happen again. She'll be disciplined." The word did not blink. The father did not answer. Silence is a currency in rooms like this. He had a lot of it, knew how to spend it. When he finally spoke, the sound surprised him first. "Wait." Diana paused. The swing door to the kitchen a step away. The smell of steam and lemon, far more honest than perfume. "What's your full name?" he asked. Her chin lifted a notch. "Diana Johnson." He said it again, not because he hadn't heard, but because saying is how some men make truths stick. He reached into his jacket and drew out a card, pressed so deep the letters left valleys in the paper. "My office," he said. "Tomorrow, 10. She took the card without looking down. Her eyes flickered, for the first time, to the boys, and she nodded to him in a language that didn't need verbs. She placed the folded apron on the tray like a flag that would not be planted here again tonight, and pushed through the door into heat and clatter and a narrower kind of honesty. The hallway smelled like bleach and onions. A cook banged a pan with the rhythm of a man getting through. Diana leaned her back to the cool tile for 1 beat, counted to 3 with the same care she uses for strangers' crystal, and slipped the card into her purse beside a receipt for markers and tape and the scrap of notebook paper where she'd sketched a balance drill for a girl who refused to be gentle with herself. She should have felt afraid. She didn't. She felt the aftertaste of a decision made without permission and the weight of a room that had not been designed to witness it. In the dining room, air thawed, forks lowered, conversations reheated like leftovers, and the piano climbed into safer territory as if to tuck the night back in and pretend it hadn't shifted. "Dad," Lucas said. Not loud. He had a way of asking questions that made them heavier. "Why did you do that?" Richard's thumb pressed into the valley of his own card until the edge bit. He looked at his son as if seeing, for a second, not the set of problems to be managed, but the person who had just led a room that didn't know how to follow. He did not answer. He was out of the habit. They ate in a new, crooked quiet. Lucas tapped the knife with 1 finger, feathering the sound to feel its weight. The father watched the swing door breathe in and out, and knew the card in her hand would be the wrong door if he made it one, and the right door if he learned how to knock without owning the hinges. In the alley behind the kitchen, the city exhaled steam into a thin cold. Delivery trucks snored. Diana stepped into the night, lifted her face to air that didn't judge, and let the string inside her chest unwind 2 inches while she counted with a steady mouth. 1, 2, 3, then laughed once at nothing in particular, the kind of laugh that lives at the edge of fear and refuses to move in. Back at table 12, Lucas hovered a fingertip over the condensation ring on his glass. He pressed it, lifted it, made a faint print on the linen like a moon he could own. "Does it always feel like you're going to fall right before you don't?" he asked, almost curious. "Sometimes," his father said. He did not add, "especially when it matters." The pianist played a phrase where the left hand carried more weight than the right. and a building made for certainty settled by a fraction, the way structures do, once the heat has clicked off and the hidden beams remember their job. When the check came, the pen felt heavier. Names carry different when the wrist knows it's writing into a changed room. Outside, spring kept pressing at the glass, polite as a beggar, patient as a tide. The tower drank the morning, glass through the sun back in measured diamonds that slid across marble like coins. Diana crossed the lobby with her purse close and the bone-white card warm against her palm. Writing the small count, she used to steady hands when the room wanted proof she belonged. Name, the receptionist asked. Diana Johnson. To see Mr. Montgomery, she said, voice even. The woman's eyes skimmed the skirt bought on sale, the blouse pressed twice before dawn, then flicked to a screen that ruled in a tone both bright and bored, and a printer coughed up a badge, like permission cut from plastic. 18th floor blinked up a column of light. In the elevator, Stale breathed cool, and her reflection multiplied to a chorus. She watched numbers climb 1, 2, 3. Then the arithmetic. The city prefers and placed the card between two fingers at chest height, as if holding a metronome, where pulse and fear meet to negotiate. Winters met her at the doors, mid-40s. Posture that made air behave. Choose too efficient for vanity. Miss Johnson, she said, already turning. Tablet angled like a shield. And they moved through a corridor hung with framed victories and silent glass, where meetings went on like weather. No one could interrupt. He'll be a minute, Winters said. She opened a waiting room so symmetrical it hissed. Mr. Montgomery dislikes delays, she added. Then let the sentence hang until its joke revealed itself, and Diana let a corner of her mouth agree before smoothing it with the pad of her thumb on the purse strap. You work here long? Diana asked. Long enough to know where the sharp edges are, Winters said. Her eyes traveled over Diana's blouse, paused at the thinning stitched seam at the shoulder, then returned to the door with the practiced disinterest of someone who has learned triage that doesn't leave marks. The office took half the floor to ceiling windows sold Manhattan back to itself. Richard stood with his back to the view, like a man who learns better facing the thing he can control. The desk, its surface so clean, it rebuked memories of hands that don't stop when the music does. Miss Johnson, he said, turning. Thank you for coming. He gestured to a chair that waited like a test and sat opposite without looking at the city. And the first sound after the door clicked was the quiet of a man deciding whether he wanted to win or change. Diana set her purse on her lap. She aligned the strap with the chair arm, small ritual. He watched the movement the way men do when they're trained to read tells, and missed the one that mattered, the steady breath that had nothing to sell, counting soft in the back of her throat while the room tried to take it. Your background, he asked. Child development, she said. New. Masters interrupted, she added, thumb-tapping once at the word, then twice, then nothing, and he nodded, as if he knew interruptions as theory, instead of rent notices folded into drawers beside untouched scholarship letters. You work 3 jobs, he said. A folder on his desk opened like a mouth already speaking. He slid out photographs of a cinder-block room that had made itself kind. A circle of kids concentrating without apology. A poster, lettered in permanent marker, that refused beige. Your rhythm. Your rules. Freedom steps, he said. With my sister. Yes. He set down a printout of a grant application, stamped rejected, 3 times red blocks. He could feel even through paper, and the word tightened the air between them until she loosened it with a breath and a look that chose no one's pity. I want you to work for me, he said, as a therapeutic companion for my son. His hand flattened the page, palm pressing a crease out of nothing, eyes leaving a brief fingerprint on a photograph behind him, woman mid-laugh, hair in motion, baby at her hip, and returning to find his face in order. I have specialists, he said. Physical therapy, Neurology. Psychology. The list that proves effort. What happened at Kingsley's? He continued, each syllable handled carefully. Worked. And he met her gaze not like a man buying a service, but like a man admitting something to a stranger because it wouldn't survive the living room. It was a dance, she said. He shook his head once. Slow. It was the first time he smiled in 2 years. And the sentence landed between them with the kind of weight paperwork never holds. While the windows pretended the river moved all on its own, I can pay you 5 times your rate. Money behaves for me, he added, as if confessing a flaw. Diana inhaled, held, let it out on 3, and the silence stretched not as defiance, but as contour, giving the room a shape where the offer had made a blur. No, she said. It was not a performance of courage. It sounded like a right measurement spoken out loud, and for a beat he looked almost relieved, then almost angry at the relief. And finally, something older, tired of being correct in rooms that were drowning on schedule. I don't work for men who see class before competence, she said, and I don't stage care for a fee. My son deserves better than performance, he said, catching himself inside her sentence and finding no place to sit, and the folder on the desk whispered as the air moved, paper rasping like an animal turning in sleep. You don't know my son, he said quietly. I know cages, she said, just as quiet. The visible ones are easier to unlock, and she reached into her purse and placed a small white card on the desk, its corners softened by fingers, the ink insisting through wear. Freedom Steps, 2A through 4, 00 p.m. First class free. He stared at the card. Next to it, his own bone-white rectangle regarded the room like a judge. He lined them together without meaning to, and the contrast made poor and expensive look like different dialects of the same sentence. Show up, or don't. The windows held their breath. A horn far below threw one sharp note against the glass. Was it staged? He asked, finally giving suspicion its due, and she shook her head. That clean movement pride makes when it refuses to dress itself as anger. And the answer arrived without apology. He stood. I followed. Winters opened the door a notch. Her eyes measured and returned to neutral before anyone could think to own them. Do you need anything? She asked the room at large, which is to say, she asked the woman with the card and the man with the view whether either planned to make this building heavier than it already was. We're fine, Richard said. We are, Diana said, and they both heard the difference. Winters inclined her head and closed the door, leaving the soft hiss of seals returning to duty and the small sound of someone's shoes learning to behave on expensive floors. You had my proposals, Richard said, a half-question trapped in a statement. You rejected them, she said, a fact without edge. He pressed thumb to red stamp until the paper dimpled, then released, as if the gesture might backdate his decision and land on a better day when the word had moved from no to wait. There's a program, he said. There's a father, she answered. The words met and didn't clash, just looked at each other the way two animals look across water when they both want the same thing but have different ideas about the shore. He picked up his own card. He set it on the desk between them as if remaking a promise. My office can help with funding, he said, and she gave him the smallest smile, the kind reserved for people who are almost useful, then slid her card beside his until the two formed a narrow door no one could walk through alone. Come today, she said. 4 o'clock. Bring him. The invitation sat down in his chest where the apology had wanted to live, and he nodded before his posture remembered to have doubts. Then nodded again, smaller, like the second count that makes a decision durable. In the hallway, the air smelled like citrus and copier heat. Winters stepped in next to her, walking without escorting. You told him no, she said, tone flat as marble, and Diana said, yes. And Winter's mouth did what passes for a smile when someone finds a rule they wish they'd been hired to protect. People like you lose jobs when rooms like that get embarrassed. Winters said, people like me start other rooms. Diana said. They stood for a beat where the carpet met the tile. Their shoes pointed in different directions, and Winters looked down the corridor, as if measuring an exit that could also serve as an entrance if the signage ever got honest. Back in the office, Richard didn't sit. He turned to the glass and saw his reflection inside the skyline. Then he opened his laptop, logged into the Foundation archive, and clicked 3 red-stamped proposals that deserved better than the dust his password had paid for. Reading abstract lines that tried to turn the quiet miracle of follow into academic sentence. Non-directive movement. Self-initiated. Get strategy. Neural reconfiguration that sounded less like a machine than a hymn if you held the paper at the right distance and thought about rooms where breath makes a count and the body answers from someplace older than policy. He closed the laptop. He placed the cheap white card on top of it like a weight. The phone sat under his palm a second before he picked it up and dialed a number he usually reserved for logistics and rides and questions about homework. He never asked, "Hey, buddy," he said when Lucas answered. "What's up?" Lucas said, a boy trying on casual. "I want to show you a place this afternoon," Richard said, and waited as if silence were now part of the language he owed his son. Then added, "A place where you lead." The pause felt like a step mid-air. "Okay," Lucas said. Richard let the breath go he'd been holding without naming it, and put the card back on the desk like a small square of gravity. Then called Winters and said, "I need to move meetings," and Winters said, "I already did." He stood alone a moment longer. He looked at the 2 cards, cheap and pressed, sharing wood. He lifted his hand and didn't touch either one, then set his palm flat on the desk, skin to surface, and counted quietly, not for composure this time, but for rhythm. He intended to keep 1, 2, 3. The warehouse carried the warm dust of old thread. Light fell in big, honest rectangles that made the floor look like promise. Handmade posters leaned off cinder block. Your rhythm, your rules. Every move counts, while a speaker found a beat and settled into a pulse that seeped under skin and told ankles to loosen. "There's a Bentley double parked," Zoe said. She held a tub of wristbands like candy no one would steal. "Green for media, red for privacy. And if he shows up in a sweater, I'll pretend casual is a language I speak," she added, snapping one on with a grin that did most of its work at the corners. Lucas entered first, a small decision made into motion. He paused to inventory the room the way a scout learns to eyes sweeping cones, mats, the mirror that didn't judge. A girl in a chair spun clean circles. A boy with a carbon fiber limb tapped a rhythm onto tape, and the air held detergent and rubber and the faint metallic tang of old radiators waking up. Richard came after, a shade behind. The sweater tried for humility. The shoes betrayed habit. He found the back wall and leaned there, hands in pockets like a man practicing not to interfere, gaze moving from exits to windows to his son, and then refusing to leave. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana said, crossing from the studio, gray t-shirt, Centair logo. Hair tied back like work had a grip. "Welcome to Freedom Steps," she offered, and gave Lucas the look she'd made for kids who were deciding if a room would punish them for moving. Her body angled to leave a lane that belonged only to him. "This isn't therapy," Richard said to Zoe. "I hire the best of that." "How's that been working out?" she asked lightly, then slid him toward a folding chair with one palm and a bureaucrat's smile. And the metal legs shrieked a little, as if performing annoyance on cue. The door sighed again and recalibrated the air. "Doctor," Mercer walked in, cane clicking a 44 that put the room in time, gray braids, eyes that measured without subtracting, and a presence that made people straighten not from fear, but because accuracy felt good inside their bones when she was around. "We've corresponded," Richard said, standing. "You have rejected me 3 times, she said pleasantly. "I oversee the research arm here, non-directive movement, self-initiated gait, neural reconfiguration. And in practice, that means we give children conditions to surprise us, and resist the urge to claim the surprise as our own." He glanced past her to a corkboard, laminated bands, media protocols. A black steel lockbox sat like a small law. On its label in clean type, "File Handoff Time Device ID, Signature Chain of Custody," with a clipboard beneath, and pens on strings like a church that had learned something sharp about trust. "I thought this was a community class," he said. "It is," Diana replied, "not defensive." A pilot folded into a class data, anonymized, oversight approved, methods that translate to kitchens and playgrounds, and a floor that forgives because failure is loud before it's useful, she added, tapping her shoe once, as if to remind the concrete of its job. Reporters slid in like cats who knew better. 2 cameras, 1 notebook. A producer already mouthing, "Will stay behind the tape." Zoo flashed green bands, pointed at the line marked "Observe Only," and stage whispered, "We charge extra for billionaires who hover," earning a smothered laugh from a cameraman who had learned between gigs that kids read faces better than adults. "What is this?" Richard asked Diana under his breath. "Part 2, she said, not blinking. "We published preliminary results this morning, small but honest, and invited the press to watch like citizens instead of scavengers. If they behave, they can leave with a story about work you can't fake for a lens." She led him down a short hall. The side room felt like a chapel made from clip frames and tape. Photographs lined the walls, children mid-try, knees in negotiation, hands learning where to be, with messy handwriting under each. 2 seconds unassisted, 7 in 6 weeks. Stairs with 2 rails, 1, smiles per session, 0.3. And between them, a beat of quiet that tasted like pride, that remembered rent. The last wall held an empty frame. Beneath it, a tag in marker read "Our Future." 500 kids a year instead of 50, Diana said, fingertips resting on the wood as if checking its pulse. "A lab we don't have to borrow. A lobby with shade at noon. A schedule that doesn't punish working parents for asking. You orchestrated the restaurant, the office, this," he said. "I recognized moments and said yes faster," she answered. 4 months ago your assistant canceled a meeting without reading our proposal. I promised myself if I ever got you in a room again, I'd bring something you couldn't file under talking points and forget." "Diana," Zoe's voice cracked down the hallway. "It's Lucas." They moved Richard 3 fast strides. Diana with the calm speed of someone trained to run without frightening the herd, and the main room gathered tight. The music dimming, as if it understood the difference between accompaniment and noise. Lucas stood inside a small circle of kids, one brace unbuckled, set beside his sneaker like a loyal animal at rest. His breath ran quick, then steadied, eyes on a tape line that cut the floor clean, chin tipped the angle of a person giving himself permission in public and deciding to live with the cost. "Lucas," Richard said, stepping forward. Diana's palm lifted into his path and did not touch him. "Wait," she said, voice level enough to level the room, and the stillness in that hand became the quiet object every silence needs. Tension exhaled into it, lights hummed harder, and the bubble machine forgot its gag. 1, Lucas whispered. 2, he let 3 ride the length of his exhale and shifted weight, heel feeling for ground, knee negotiating truth and habit, hips hunting stability like a shy animal. And the wobble arrived with teeth and then softened when his body remembered kneeling counts, the rise converting tremor into step. The cheer was not fireworks, it was weather-breaking, a clean scrape of chairs, an involuntary ah, from someone who didn't trust their own optimism. The camera shutters murmured like rain on a tin roof, and Dr. Mercer tapped her cane twice, science's small superstition, before writing something down without looking away. That, Diana said to no one, and to everyone, it belongs to him. Richard's lashes held water. He refused to blink away, the city behind him blurring at the edges, and for a second he looked less like a man with a tower and more like a person who had just watched breath change matter in public and survived his impulse to help. A mic arrived with a careful angle. "Mr. Montgomery, sources say your foundation rejected this program 3 times." He glanced at the empty frame in the side room and at the lockbox where signatures meant custody, and at his son, now showing a younger boy where to put a hand without making it about hands, and he set his shoulders into the shape of someone done performing correctness. "You know what's hardest for someone like me?" he said, admitting when we're wrong. He let the sentence sit as if it needed to learn the room, then added, "The Montgomery Foundation will fund Freedom Steps for 5 years and build a permanent center based on this methodology," each word pressed straight. "No garnish, no theater." Zoe made a noise like a sob stepping on a laugh. Cameras flashed and then, respectfully, lowered. "On one condition," he continued, turning to Diana. "Programmatic autonomy remains with Freedom Steps, no corporate interference." And Winters, who had slipped in at some point and taken up her favorite post 2 steps right of him, let a corner of her mouth acknowledge a sentence she'd wanted to hear said out loud. "Autonomy," Diana repeated. "Say it again." "Autonomy," he said, and the syllables looked better on him. And Dr. Mercer's pen paused mid-scratch, as if the ink had decided to remember this page. The producer eased her crew back a stripe. Reporters drifted wider. The way tide loosens after a pier, kids tried again. The room returning to work, the way good rooms do, and Richard stood not exactly smaller but more accurate, as if some glamour had lifted and left him with edges that matched things he could pick up and carry. He slipped away to the side room. The empty frame waited like an intake of breath. From his wallet, he drew the bone-white card with letters pressed deep enough to bruise paper, hesitated, then tucked it onto the narrow shelf beneath the frame, like an offering to humility no one had demanded, and his thumb dragged once across the embossing as if sanding it down. Back in the main space, music returned in a soft 4. The light shifted, warmer, truer, dust bright as pollen. Lucas stood on the tape again, counted quietly because the day required practice and not performance. And Richard leaned against the wall with his hands useless in his pockets and felt the rhythm lodge in his chest where speeches can't reach one. 2, 3. The room found its pressure again. Cones scraped. Wheels hummed. Breath kept score. Diana watched from the edge, saw a shy boy edge closer, and let silence do the heavy lifting while the floor kept its promise. And the new claw's autonomy settled into the day like furniture. No one would dare move without asking. When the press finally packed their cords, the building exhaled. Zoe peeled tape from the floor with a satisfying rip and saved the straightest strips for later. Richard took a photo he didn't post, sun pooling on concrete, the edge of the empty frame in the corner, and then he looked instead, long enough to make remembering easy, and counted once more. Out of habit, he meant to keep 1, 2, 3. The lockbox clicked like a metronome with manners. Diana checked the seal, the clipboard, the pens that lived on strings. She ticked through the morning's fragile order bracelets, sorted cones, taped, camera zones roped quietly, counting under breath the rhythm that steadied hands when rooms wanted to decide for her. 1, 2, 3. The room worked in low hums and careful scuffs. AC breathed from vents. Rubber mats held their ground. Sanitizer bit the air. Light fell through the high windows in clean rectangles that dared bodies to step inside. And posters made by small, impatient hands told the truth without punctuation. Your rhythm, your rules. While the speaker found a bass line gentle enough to carry failure without bruising it, media arrived like cats who'd eaten, headphones on necks, lanyards flashing green, smiles tuned to safe. Winters met them with 2 wristbands and a look that made tape lines holy, then walked them past the sign, "Media Observe Only," like a docent giving a tour of a museum that refused to hang children on walls. "Circle up," Diana called. Her voice could set a table or a tempo. Names went around like a softball, and the first drills were small. Ankles, exploring edges. Hips, remembering permission. Breath, learning not to hide when a room watched, while the bubble machine coughed in the corner like a relative who laughs at the wrong part and gets forgiven anyway. Richard stood by the wall and practiced stillness. Hands in pockets, hintukt, shoes anchored to humility. The urge to be useful tugged like a misfit dog, but he watched it sit when asked, eyes tracking from kid to cone to lockbox, landing last on the boy who had learned to hold his own weight with the stubborn joy of a new language. Autonomy ladder today, Diana told the kids. You call your rung, you call stop. She crouched by Lucas, level with the stubborn in his shoulders, and matched her breath to his while he unlatched the first strap. The small, clean sound puncturing the room's hush without asking anyone to pick a side. He set the brace on the floor like a little silver animal. Doped line ahead. Dust floating. Sneaker rubber faint against concrete. He inhaled and let his count show itself. 1, 2, 3. Then shifted, knee hunting a truce. Hip correcting. Heel tasting the ground with the caution of an explorer who's learned to mistrust maps that promise shortcuts. On step 2, the floor slid wrong. Momentum bared teeth. Future rushed up bright and fast. Richard moved without permission 2 long strides before Diana's palm rose into his path. The quiet object every silence needs. Not touching, simply present enough for breath to organize itself and translate falling into kneel, kneel into squat, and squat into a stuttering rise that belonged to the boy alone. Sound returned in small increments. A chair leg scraped. Someone forgot to exhale and remembered. The glitter sneaker girl wiped one eye with the heel of her hand and pretended to be bored. And Lucas laughed once short, cracked, unpretty, and tried a step that wasn't better, so much as braver, because it arrived after a scare and asked for nothing but the next one. A columnist leaned past the tape until Winters's eyebrow herded him back. "Miss Johnson," a reporter said, keeping the mic respectful, boundaries with cameras, and Diana walked them to the table, like she was showing them where the good knives lived. IRB, stamp here, consent forms in clean stacks, green and red bands, and the black steel box that logged every file like a ledger against forgetting. "We anonymize. We publish aggregate," she said. "No close-ups. No B-roll without assent." Her knuckles brushed the lockbox, steady as a gavel without theater, and the cameraman who had learned a few things from bad gigs angled his frame to feet and floor, away from faces, as if the room had taught him a better shot. The columnist tried a spin toward Richard. "How much of this is image repair?" he said, almost smiling. Richard watched Lucas show a younger boy where to place a palm without telling him he was doing it wrong, felt the old reflex to justify scratch at his ribs, then put a finger on his own pulse and matched it to breath 1. 2 held the third beat, a fraction longer before answering. "I'm learning," he said. The line sat there, una dorned, daring itself to be true. Around them, the room didn't flinch. Dr. Mercer's cane ticked a small approval. Zoe muttered something about charging extra for humility and found a cone that had tried to escape, while the producer lowered her mic a notch, as if gratitude had a physical weight. Break cut the room into island. Sips of water, hands shaken out, wrists rolled. The glitter sneaker girl found Lucas by the tape and tilted her chin in the direction of the shy boy pressed to a pillar. Lucas nodded, and they drifted over together and said nothing, because invitations land better when they don't wear verbs. Winters navigated with a clipboard and a dark art. She redirected a donor selfie to a wall with names no one else read. She pulled Diana aside with a line as soft as a sash. Board wants a memo. Optics. Risk. Deliverables, then added, I wrote autonomy clause non-negotiable twice, and Diana's mouth twitched, the closest she came to relief, while people were watching. The second half began with smaller ambitions, weight shifts to a drum loop that barely existed, eyes closed if brave. Touches for following, Diana told a volunteer, guiding her hand to hover near a shoulder instead of owning it. And the woman tried, failed, tried again, the small shake in her fingers more honest than any speech about consent. Lucas asked for the top rung again. Not for them, he said, tilting his head toward the tape. For me, and Diana nodded, and the unbuckling was workmanlike this time, the body negotiating like a union that had read the contract twice, the wobble arriving on schedule and getting bent into a half-step that looked like choreography, because practice eventually tricks the eye. Reporters coiled cables. The cameraman signed the log, slid a drive into the box. The columnist left with a notebook full of lines that could go either way, and the bubble machine, having survived another day of being tolerated, hiccuped twice and thought better of it. While the building resumed its background hum like relief, learning to modulate, Richard waited until the room eased. He found Diana by the mirror, wiping condensation with her sleeve. How do you know when to touch? He asked, and she didn't look at him, just watched the cloth leave a clean arc on glass and said, when touching is following, not fixing, then set the rag down and let the silence talk him the rest of the way. He nodded once. A small admission. Tomorrow, Winters said, appearing like punctuation. Board wants language. They can read. And he said, they'll get data. And she said, and a sentence that behaves like English. And he tried, we're following what worked. And Winters' smile showed a single tooth, the kind reserved for unlikely progress. Cleanup moved like choreography. No one rehearsed. Mats stacked. Cones rattled into a bin. Tape lifted with a satisfying rip. Doctor. Mercer tapped the lockbox twice, science's superstition, and Zoe tucked consent forms into a folder that had survived rain and a coffee spill, and one afternoon in a car trunk, the smell of cardstock and sanitizer quietly announcing a day that had earned its fatigue. Near the back wall, Lucas stood on the line alone. He breathed visibly, unashamed of counting. His heels searched, found, wobbled, then settled, and no one cheered because no one saw, and that's how some progress prefers it unwitnessed, uncaptioned, folding itself into muscle like a secret that doesn't mind being known later. Richard watched the boy's lips shape a silent 3. He didn't move. His hands stayed in his pockets like they'd finally learned a job that wasn't fixing, and he let his chest answer the room's tempo. Inhale, hold, release, measuring what it cost to be present and useless and proud. Diana locked the box and felt the click in her palm. She tugged once at the tape edge she'd missed and left it. On the wall, the sun slid lower, the clean rectangle of light shifting a step toward the door as if rehearsing an exit, and the day held its breath a final second before letting go of itself in the smallest way that still counts. 1, 2, 3. The boardroom was built to keep pulse rates down, glass on 3 sides, water in thin-lipped tumblers, almonds pretending to be mercy. Richard set both hands on the table and, under his breath where habit lives, counted 1, 2, 3 before he stood into the air that money keeps cold. IRB approved. Consent protocol here. He slid a folder, not a show, just paper with spines. Charts rose in quiet colors, baselines, increments, dots that moved across weeks, and he kept his voice plain, the way you speak in rooms that trap echo. Cement suits on his left, A philanthropist with hair like a blade on his right. Someone coughed into a fist that had voted against risk for decades. Winters sat at his shoulder, tableli, heel tapping a private tempo. When she looked up, it was to spare him from the impulse to be clever. Optics, said the cougher. Our donors love tradition, said the blade. Then fund a portrait, Richard said, surprising even himself with the temperature. We'll fund progress. And he laid the grant instrument down, where the table would have to carry it, autonomy in bold, like a scar you choose to keep. Legal frowned without showing teeth. The clause limits intervention, she said, as if reading his posture for weaknesses. That's the design, he answered. Programmatic control stays with them. We watchdog ethics and data. We do not tweak children. Through the glass, the river kept its temper, phones face down like obedient pets. A consultant breathed over a speaker, airport lounge air hissing as if to warn them against being interesting. Winters finally spoke, voice level enough to file. Their media protocol exceeds ours, she said. Chain of custody logs. No close-ups without assent. We recommend keeping the autonomy clause intact. She didn't look at him when she said it, which told him she meant all of it. A trustee raised 2 fingers. What if outcomes slip? Then we pause funding with cause. Richard said, not because donors are itchy. Votes took shape in the air. Hands lifted, hesitated, committed. Motion carried. And something in his chest unclenched with a small ache, like a muscle remembering it once had other jobs than holding a posture afterward. Hallway, air felt warmer. Winters fell in beside him without ceremony. You'll need language that can be read at a gala, she said, preferably by people eating lamb. We're following what worked, he said. Her mouth twitched. Plain English. Bold. Who are you? Trying, he said, and earned the smallest nod she gave. He didn't send a driver to the warehouse. He carried the news like a fragile cup. Inside, the afternoon hummed rubber, faint bleach, the soft ratchet of a chair being coaxed. Diana was taping a corner that refused to obey, hair pulled back, face set to the concentration she wore like a tool belt. He waited until she finished smoothing the tape. The apology wasn't scripted. He didn't trust himself with speeches. I've compensated, he said. Policies, funds, the public vow, but I never said it. He stood there with empty hands, cleared his throat once, and made himself brave enough to count 1, 2, 3 before adding the part that cost. I'm sorry. Diana looked at him the way she watched a child choose a pace. No rescue. No performance. Then carry chairs, she said. 20. The blue ones bite, and when he laughed, it surprised him looser, cheaper than the laugh he wore in rooms where glass pretends to be sky. He carried metal bit skin and left an honest mark. Zoe passed with a staple gun singing and a list of small wars. Dr. Mercer argued with a censor that refused kindness until she charmed it into telling the truth. And the place felt like a body early in recovery, clumsy. Headed somewhere, bulldozers arrived at dawn 2 weeks later. Steel ribs took sky and learned weather. They staged a beam in dust and handed out a marker on string. Kids signed their names in letters that sloped toward future, ink pooling where excitement pressed too hard. Architects came with renderings and beige euphemisms. Diana vetoed beige, the way a bouncer vetoes trouble calm. Inevitable. Light at kid height, she said. Floors that forgive. Mirrors that don't steal. And the lead architect nodded like a person learning a language he should have known already. In the job trailer that smelled like burnt coffee and printed ink, budgets misbehaved, forgiving floor costs. The contractor announced as if affection were a sin. Then we cut furniture. Richard said, people don't learn on chairs. And the man's brows jumped, because billionaires usually buy tables and skip the floor. Winters fought a zoning quirk that blocked a curb cut. She sat in an office where time wears a badge and used it against itself. My sister used a chair, she told the clerk, gentle as a map. You don't want to sign the letter that says nice to have when a fire drill gets real. And left with a temporary yes that wanted to become permanent, he wrote the donor letter at his kitchen counter. No PR brush. No choreographed contrition. We're funding freedom steps because the data persuades and the work protects dignity. We will not direct methods. We will not brand children. Our job is to move obstacles and then get out of the way. He read it aloud to the stovetop and didn't change a line. In the middle of everything, Lucas came home angry and upright. Therapist says, 2 more years, he said, shoving a sneaker off with the angry foot. Richard listened without fixing, then made the call no one hears in speeches, ending a contract with a resume. So polished it blinded, the quiet that followed felt right, not triumphant. They visited a school with stairs that lived up to their purpose. Richard measured door widths with his eyes and the speed of fire alarms with his hand. A teacher with chalk on her sleeve asked Lucas questions and waited for him to answer them himself. And Richard liked the way the boy's mouth decided around new words, maybe later. Try. In the trailer that afternoon, drafts had teeth, paper tossed up numbers that pretended to be maps. An inspector frowned at a rail by ½ an inch and took 2 weeks. A donor suggested a logo wall at the entrance and got politely exiled to Hall B on the quarterly report. The sink at the warehouse died without grace. He drove over with a gasket and a wrench he knew how to use. Water let go in a cold arc and spotted his sleeves. Zoe leaned in the doorway and watched him swear into the cabinet with a kindness that didn't need cover. We should sell tickets, she said. Billionaire fixes thing he can see. Dark humor traveled well in rooms where the rent on hope is due weekly. The sink stopped leaking. They clapped once quietly, because dignity then went back to building something that would have to justify itself every day. A week later, he found the right words for donors who loved him least when he became human. Winters read the draft and didn't mark it. You'll lose some, she said. You'll find others who meant their toasts. And he sent the letter like a small boat into weather and let it vanish into inboxes and tax seasons. Near dusk, he walked the lot with a coffee that had gone wrong. Rebar slept in rows, and the banner on the fence snapped a little. He watched a crewman climb out of a backhoe and pat its flank like an animal after a good run, and felt the night take the heat out of things without stealing their momentum. He texted Diana a photo of his scribbled margins. In a textbook, he had no business owning questions about attentional focus, about external cues, winning over internal ones. She sent back an image of a wall at the warehouse, photos of kid, stats under each, the empty frame with "or future" in marker. Almost time to hang this, she wrote. Almost, he answered, and believed it. At home, the apartment kept the quiet of a life rearranging itself. He set his phone face down, then up again, then face down. Lucas texted from the hallway. Coach says, I can try keep away with everyone Friday. Can you watch but not help? And Richard read it twice, and, before typing anything, stood very still and breathed the small rhythm he had carried from one room to the next. 1, 2, 3, until his reply felt like the right size. I can follow, he wrote. The words sat on the screen without decoration. He hit send and let the room keep its modest temperature while, outside, a crane folded itself against the dark and waited to resume the grammar of morning. Steele woke first. A crane drew clean grammar against a hard blue morning, while the sight smelled like wet dirt and cut rebar. Its backing beeps fell in threes, 1, 2, 3 small metronomes that steadied hands and made the new bones of the building feel like they were learning their own breath. Kids waited with a marker tied to string. A beam lay on trestles like a plank ready for vows. Zariah rolled up and signed in loops. Amir printed with the care of a boy who knows letters are prosthetics. And Lucas pressed too hard, so the ink bled, then grinned because imperfection looked like forward motion on metal. The trailer ran on burnt coffee and printer heat. Plans sprawled in pale blues and urgent red circles. Diana leaned over the largest sheet, not touching, and said, "Light at kid height, floors that forgive, mirrors for seeing, not judging," while her fingertip hovered like a needle finding thread through a fabric that wanted to be woven wrong. "We've done pediatric wings." The architect tried. His blazer smelled faintly of cedar and certainty. Winters didn't look up from her tablet when she said, "Hard corners bounce sound. We baffle the ceiling. Lose the hospital white. And no donor beige, unless you're planning to treat boredom." And a pencil stopped squeaking in a hand that had expected less friction. "Doctor." Mercer arrived with a cane that clicked in 4 time. She scanned the layout without adjusting her posture. "The lab must look like play," she said. "Cameras kind and shy. Data honest and anonymized," then tapped a blank square. "Archive room stories of methods that broke in useful ways." And the architect wrote it in as if he'd always believed in rooms for failure. "What do we call it?" he asked. "Not a name that can be carved," she said. Richard, half in the doorway, with sleeves pushed to the quiet part of his forearms, said, "Room of first tries." And Dr. Mercer's mouth made a shape that wasn't a smile until you earned it. Outside, wind worried the chain-link fence. A banner snapped, designed by experts, the kids. The smell of cut lumber drifted through and stuck to their clothes. And for a moment, nobody spoke. Hands planted on paper like you steady a child who sways and refuses to sit. The internet did its trick. 5 cheap seconds of Lucas stumbling found a million eyes. A caption smirked at a boy who had made a room braver, and before PR could write a sentence, a parent posted the green and red bands. The lockbox label, "File handoff," device's signature, and a story about consent that moved like clean water under the mockery. Parking lines became a small war. A curb cut choked in code, and a hedge fell in love with itself. Winters walked a stack of maps into a city office that smelled like old toner and apology, and told a clerk about a fire drill, an ignored ramp, and a detention slip. The man stared at his stamp as if it were a mirror and said, "Temporary variant," like a person deciding who he wanted to be on paper. Afternoon burned down to honest heat. Richard stood near the half-built frame and read research with a pen. He underlined "external focus," "outperforms internal cues," and wrote "Ask Diana." "Point to the line, not the knee." Then took a photo of the margin mess and texted it with "studying to follow," surprised at the pleasure of not pretending expertise. Lucas found a soccer practice that didn't flinch. The field smelled like cut grass and old rubber. Inside tap, outside tap. The coach said, voice bright as chalk, and when he stumbled she called, "Good fall," like a medal, and he leaned into the count that had followed him from concrete to turf. 1, 2, 3, until the ball began to behave like a shy friend. Contracts arrived with earnest teeth. Budgets pulled faces. No one trusted. In the trailer, the contractor said, "Forgiving floor costs, forgiving money," and Richard answered, "Cut optics," while a young engineer traced the East Bay with a finger and said, "Morning glare, October through January." And Dr. Mercer chose angle over fins because, she said, "I refuse to make the building look like a product." Zoe blew in with staples and neighborhood news. "The bakery wants a 3rd Saturday bake sale," she said. "The mural kids are asking for wall space." And the warehouse sink finally died like a martyr. And Richard grabbed a gasket and a wrench and drove across town because sometimes the only thing a man should fix is the thing he can reach with both hands. The sink coughed up cold water. Metal bit his knuckles and left clean crescents. "Sell tickets," Zoe said from the doorway, deadpan. "Richmond versus gasket 2 rounds." And his laugh came out easy, cheaper than the ones he'd spent in rooms where laughs cost more than they were worth. Rain took a week hostage. Concrete delayed. Tempers shortened. And a rumor grew teeth. A developer with renderings like Cologne wanted to activate the block. Richard met him in a glass bar that pretended to be Sky and said, "Children bring life," then texted Winters under the table, "Find coalition. Keep the streets small." The reply came back with a photo of parcels circled in lipstick red. Evenings returned to the warehouse. The air held detergent and chalk dust, and the iron smell of effort cooling. "Doctor." Mercer found Diana by the mirror and said, "I prefer mentoring to floor work these days. 12-hour days are for knees that still lie," and placed a ring of keys in her palm, one old and stubborn like a door that insists you mean it. "Archives," Diana asked. "Everything before it got tidy." Mercer said, "Consent language we threw out with relief. Diagrams that made me argue with my own handwriting. Failures that taught faster than success, and the room felt bigger, as if someone had opened a window that had been painted shut on purpose." Night folded the site into itself. Drywall arrived, and the building changed its voice. Hollows stopped echoing and started speaking. Paint went up in colors you could name without a chipped sky: mango, slate, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and dust, while letters from the sign shop lay on a table like loose teeth waiting for a jaw. Midway through a Thursday, an inspector frowned at a handrail. "Half an inch is half an inch," he said, and left behind 2 weeks. Diana exhaled through her nose, cut a fresh piece of tape, and remarked the temporary path, like a person who had learned to bargain with time, while still insisting the future keep its appointment. A quiet beat found them in the core. No saws, no phones, no arguments. Dust sailed through a high shaft of light and turned slow like a constellation sketching itself. And Richard set his palm on a newel post that hadn't yet learned fingerprints and said nothing while, somewhere outside, a truck downshifted and the world resumed. The delivery that mattered came in a shoebox. Diana placed it on Winter's desk without preamble. A title document, 2 cashier's checks, and a key on a ribbon that carried the faint ghost of a long-ago perfume. Winters read fast, stopped, and looked up like someone hearing a truth from a wall. "You sold the car," she said. "Your mother's. It was metal and sentiment," Diana said. "This is floor and future." Richard opened his mouth to reimburse and shut it when he saw her face, learning the difference between paying a bill and honoring a cost that needed to live where people could step on it without slipping. Drywall dust found the back of throats. Screw guns whispered like wind-up birds. In the lab, a sensor blinked awake and then pretended sleep, while a grad assistant adjusted its angle with 2 fingers. Dr. Mercer stood behind him and said, "If the graph can't translate to a kitchen, it belongs in a drawer." And the kid nodded, like he'd felt a door close and open in the same second. By late week, letters were laid on the floor. Freedom Steps Rehabilitation. Center waited in aluminum silence. Lucas walked the main hall with a single brace and the cautious arrogance of someone starting to believe in his own map. Stopping under a high window where the light drew a clean rectangle on the new surface, and standing in it as if heat had a shape he could borrow, he lifted his foot once. No music, no audience. The step wasn't pretty, only his, and Richard saw it from the far end, and kept his hands inside his pockets, and matched the boy's breath with the one he'd stolen from Construction 1. 2 then held the third beat longer, not as command but as permission. They planned the hanging quietly. 2 anchors, 1 level, 4 screws. The frame that had said "or future" leaned against the wall, patient, and banged at the corners, and Diana texted, "We'll need 2 people to hang this," while the building settled around them like a large animal finding its night posture. Outside, the crane folded like a giant at prayer. Inside, lights clicked down row by row. A thin smell of lemon cleaner and sawdust floated in the hall, and near the door, Winters taped a small sign that no one noticed yet: "Your pace." Your lead then stepped back to see if it sat level, and, hearing only her own breath, Let the line be a touch crooked on purpose. When they locked up, the new floor held its own quiet. It gave slightly underfoot the way trust does when it's fresh. Richard paused in the doorway and looked at the place they were making, a room where the Count had changed from survival to ceremony and took that small rhythm with him into the dark, the one that had followed steel and ink and gaskets and good falls, the one that promised he might keep learning if he kept saying it in time. 1, 2, 3. Morning tasted like citrus and fresh dust. Light poured in a long bar from the high windows and lay on the new floor like a promise that had finally shown up. Diana held one edge of the wooden frame, while Zoe watched the bubble on the level and said, "Breath on 3," and they lifted together 1, 2, 3, until the screws bit and the plaque beneath read, "The room of first tries." Paper butterflies trembled along the corridor. Someone had taped them at kid height where hands could change their flight. Beyond the double doors, aluminum letters waited under a drape, and the air carried lemon cleaner, latex paint, and the faint rubber of mats warming to bodies that hadn't arrived yet. "Bracelets front," Winters said. She parked a rolling cart by the entrance and sorted green from red with the speed of a dealer who refuses to lose. Consent forms in baskets, media behind the cloth tape, donor signage in Hall B, and if anyone asks for a VIP area, point to the floor, she added, not smiling, walkie clipped to her hip like a small baton that kept time. The first families came early, coats half-zipped, eyes scanning, shoulders braced against old habits. Kids entered at angles of their own wheels, humming, braces ticking. Sneakers skidding because friction is a language, and the room adjusted without fuss, airlifting to meet them the way a good hand meets a fall, and turns it back into movement. Dr. Mercer took the gate like a lighthouse, cane ticking, clipboard under her arm, mouth set to a patience that outlasted cameras. No visitors in the lab during assessments, she told a man with a lens and a generous jacket, then softened the edge. You can film the hallway. It's where bravery happens when nobody thinks to name it. And he nodded as if the floor had corrected him. Diana stepped into the middle. "Welcome," she said, voice low enough to make kids lean in. "We don't cut ribbons here. We open by moving." And she scanned faces until she saw the shy ones relax a notch. The wary ones find a wall. The eager ones try to swallow the room whole before it fed them. She found Lucas by the mirror. He had the stance of a boy who knows the length of a minute, brace lighter than last year. Chin tipped to conviction. He stood with Zariah and Amir and a girl named Noah, who moved with a sway. The world called wrong until someone decided to stop calling it anything at all. "Count me in," Lucas asked. "Always," Diana said, and didn't say more. The speaker found a pulse barely above a whisper, the kind of beat that makes ankles curious without waking fear, and 4 bodies took the floor like a sentence that meant to be read slow. They went simple. Forward, side, place, a breath you could hear if you wanted to. Zariah spun once and let the chair finish the circle alone. Amir tapped the line with his carbon edge. Noah let her sway, make a shape that looked like weather. And Lucas matched all 3 in turn. The way a person learns to lead, by listening first. The press kept their distance. Winters stood by the yellow cloth tape and offered a polite force field. A boom mic lowered, then lifted, then lowered again, as if learning the manners of a room that didn't perform for equipment. And the cameraman angled toward feet and floor until the shot started telling a better truth. At the pillar, a tiny boy clutched his mother's sleeve. He covered his ears for the music that wasn't loud. Lucas caught his eye, tilted his chin, the universal angle of "come if you want," then looked away so the invitation could breathe without pressure, and went back to the count he kept like a pocket prayer. 1, 2, 3, each step stitched to breath, not applause. Richard stood where he'd taught himself to stand, hands in pockets, back to the wall, posture deliberately unhelpful. The building ran around him, a hum in the vents, parents whispering strategies. the soft hiss of sanitizer, and he watched the sequence grow from neat to generous as more kids drifted into its orbit until it looked less like choreography and more like a neighborhood of Mr. Montgomery. The reporter wore a notebook instead of armor. "How does it feel to see this open?" she asked. Mike lowered like a courtesy, and he glanced at the frame by the hallway and the lockbox on its pedestal and the small boy at the pillar and said, "Like air we've owed them." Then let silence finish the thought. He moved toward the archive. The room smelled like cardboard and lemon oil and old paper, learning new names. On the low table lay journals with dog-eared pages. Along the wall, boxes labeled in a careful hand, "Consent language we fixed," methods that failed usefully, diagrams that lied. And beneath the frame, a narrow rail waited for slips of paper like promises you could touch. Zoe slid in with a handful of pencils. "Give the grandmas the good ones," she said, and he grinned because he'd learned where authority lives. An older woman with a cane wrote in large block letters. I stopped saying careful and fed the rail with the steadiness of someone who had buried a rule and wanted proof. Back in the hall, the sequence paused. The room held breath the way rooms do before something small and brave. Noah's hand trembled and she let it. Amir missed the tape and called it art. Zariah rolled backward on purpose to feel a tilt she'd been told to avoid. And Lucas looked at the shy boy again before kneeling into his own balance. Inviting without asking, the boy stepped out. Toes cautious, eyes not leaving the pillar entirely. Lucas placed his palm near the boy's shoulder without touching, matched his inhale to the smaller body's rhythm, and waited so long the music nearly forgot itself. Then whispered, "On the three we hate," and smiled like he'd said the punchline to a joke only they knew. "Three," the boy mouthed. He lifted, wobbled, placed. The room didn't cheer because the room understood debt. But a mother's hand found a mouth as if to hold in weather, and Richard felt a pressure ease in his ribs that he hadn't admitted took space. "Rooms teach." "Doctor," Mercer said beside him. He hadn't noticed her arrive, only the click of the cane. "Build them right and they do half our job. Maybe more," and he nodded as if architecture had hands, then watched the boy try it again, less afraid of the way the floor might misbehave. A donor attempted to migrate a banner. Winters intercepted with a smile that could unwrinkle paper. "Hall B," she said, steering gently. "Names belong where eyes rest after the work, not before," and the donor went along easily, because the day made selfishness feel like a poor fit. "Should I say something?" Diana asked Zoe. "People expect speeches. Say less," Zoe said, tying a loose string on a volunteer's shirt, "and make them move more." And Diana stepped forward and lifted her hands. And the noise thinned, not out of deference, but readiness. "We're here to practice trying," she said. "Failure goes on the shelf, progress goes on the floor." Her eyes touched each of the kids who needed touching, then left them alone. And she pointed at the high window where light squared itself on the surface like a window drawn by a child and said, "If you need a target, use that." The second pass broke cleaner. Bodies found the rectangle without tripping on its edges. A chair spun so exactly it ruled the corner without looking at it. A brace tapped a new rhythm on the tape. A pair of sneakers squeaked in a chord that had waited a year to resolve, and the bubble machine coughed once like applause. It couldn't help. "Director." One quote. The reporter asked Winters, "You're looking for poetry?" Winters said, "Not unkind. All I have is scheduling." And then, after a beat, "Forgiveness is a line item." And the reporter smiled like someone taking a note that didn't want to steal the scene. They toured the lab in pairs. Cameras hid behind kindness. Screens refused to brag. A graduate assistant explained calibration to a parent and cut jargon in half on the fly, while Dr. Mercer watched the parent, watched the data, and decided which parts of the paper would survive the kitchen test before she bothered to write them. In the quiet room, a volunteer lined up books, covers with animals and machines and kids, who did not apologize for standing weird. A child pressed a palm to the window and left a fog print that lingered, breath on glass in the shape of patience, and the room collected it without making a fuss. The lockbox swallowed 2 drives, signatures stacked in clean loops and anxious spikes. Diana slid the latch, listened for the click she wanted, then set the pen down and put both hands on the lid for half a second, as if asking the box to keep telling the truth when no one was looking. Near noon, heat softened the light. The rectangle on the floor drifted toward the far line like a sundial keeping honest time. Richard stood under it and watched dust hang in the bright for a breath, then fall in the slow way that reminds you the day is moving even when you think you are not. Photos, a parent asked. Green band says yes. Winters said. Red says no, and lifted a basket like a sacrament. The parent chose green with a hand that shook and took exactly 2 pictures, neither of faces, both of feet, because that's what she wanted to remember later when someone asked what progress looks like if you don't own a dictionary. They unveiled the aluminum letters last. No scissors, no flourish, just hands on cloth and patience. The fabric slid down to show the words they'd been saying under their breath for months, and somewhere between the vowels and the bolts, the building found its voice and decided to keep it. By late afternoon, the room had learned its own traffic. Kids drifted out in 2s, in 3s, in families that had stopped apologizing for how long exits take. The poster near the desk sat a degree off level, and no one fixed it because the angle felt like a wink in a space that knew when to be serious and when not to. Diana circled once more. She pressed tape edges, checked corners, lifted a cone to find a purple crayon. Someone had smuggled in like contraband joy. At the archive rail, a new slip waited in child letters, Day 1. I was not careful, and she read it twice and let her chest rise and fall slowly, as if the sentence were a weight she meant to carry in the right place. Lucas found Richard by the door, sweat at his hairline, shirt sticking to his spine where effort likes to argue. Could you see me without helping? He asked, head tilted, and Richard said, I did. And Lucas nodded like that was the right size answer, and went to gather his brace without looking at it like a confession. They left the lights on low, windows dulled to a softer rectangle that laid itself a little farther each hour. Winters locked the box. Dr. Mercer eased her knees onto a bench she'd specified into existence. Zoe stacked cups with the satisfaction of small order, and the building breathed its first tired, content breath as if buildings could remember 1, 2, 3, and then keep it for morning. The morning opened on a red sash. Polyester caught the light like a traffic flare and squeaked when its owner moved. 2 aides unrolled a step and repeat by the door while the room held the lemon of cleaner and the soft rubber smell of mats, and the click of a camera tested boundaries that Winters had already taped into law. 1, 2, 3 strips along the floor, bright as a countdown nobody was allowed to ignore. We'd love a quick walkthrough. The council member's smile had billboard stamina and teeth that knew ribbon cuttings. Winters handed him 2 wristbands, green and red, the way a dealer offers choices nobody really has, and said, observe from behind the cloth. The kids are the ones with the VIP passes, before pivoting to the aides and directing the banner back into its tube with a politeness that felt like gravity. Diana met him under the aluminum letters, clipboard in one hand, patience in the other. We're running class, she said, tone soft but not movable. And when the man gestured toward his photographer, she only stepped aside far enough to make the tape line visible, the way you show someone a fence without pushing their face into it. Kids folded the room into their speed, wheels murmured, braces tapped, breath found its lane. The council member stood behind the tape with the rest of the adults and watched a girl in a chair teach a volunteer how not to colonize a shoulder, and his sash slid left as if honesty were a weight his tailor had forgotten. Outside, Rectangles of paint turned into a quarrel. Drop-offs clogged where a curb refused to cut. Winters took a thermos and maps to a government office that smelled like old toner and linoleum fatigue, and told a clerk about a ramp ignored during a fire drill, the detention that followed, and the letter nobody wanted to sign when the story reached a newsroom. "You want a variance." The clerk looked at his stamp like it owed him courage. "I want kids out of traffic," Winters said, and waded through a long scratch of pen on paper, the kind of quiet beat where a human decides what kind of signature they want to live with until the stamp hit hard and left temporary in ink thick enough to touch. The internet found 5 seconds to punish. A clip of Lucas tripping blinked across 1,000 feeds, with a caption shaped like a smirk. He watched it once with his jaw tight, then twice, then set the phone face down and stood on the tape at class, pressing his heels to the line as if the floor could read through skin and answer. "Count me," Diana asked softly. He nodded without raising his head. On the inhale, he found 1. On the hold, he found 2. On the exhale, he said the number he hated 3 out loud. Not loud, just enough. And the step landed crooked but landed, and the glitter sneaker girl ghosted up beside him and said without looking, "I saw." Noise rose and fell like a careful tide. The camera crew stayed behind the cloth like trained cats. A mother wrote her consent in looped letters that wobbled once and then steadied, and Dr. Mercer tapped the lockbox with 2 fingers. Superstition or audit? Who could tell? And reminded a graduate assistant that if a metric doesn't survive the kitchen, it dies in the paper. By Friday, the invoice landed like a dare. Equipment, sensors, the floor buffer that kept forgiveness polished. Richard sized the number with eyes that used to enjoy their power and reached for his wallet. But Diana beat him to the desk with a shoebox and a key, ribboned in something that smelled faintly like a life lost a decade ago. "You did what?" Zoe asked. Her voice already knew the answer. Diana set down 2 cashier's checks and a title document whose corners had been rounded by years of glove compartments and glove-soft weather, then placed the key on top with a steadiness that made the room stop, pretending it wasn't watching. "It was a car," she said. "This is a floor." The sentence moved through the space like a truck through a narrow street, careful and unstoppable. And Richard began a reimbursement before he learned to close his mouth, counting quietly with the discipline of a man trying not to buy his way out of meaning. 1, 2, 3. They drove the last night in silence. The dashboard light made Zoe's knuckles look carved. At a red light, she laughed once, bright and broken, and said, "We gave up air conditioning that worked, and now we fix the whole climate of a room." And Diana snorted into the steering wheel and let a tear run so softly it felt like sweat. On Sunday, the building breathed like a sleeping animal. No music, no chatter, only HVAC and the soft tick of a settling frame. Dr. Mercer arrived with a ring of keys and placed it in Diana's palm. 1 old tooth stubborn from disuse, 1 new tooth that gleamed, then said, "Archives. Start students at the failures. It saves them from believing in genius when grit would do." The room of first tries smelled of lemon oil and cardboard. Shelves bore labels in a hand that didn't hide its age. Consent language. We fixed. Methods that failed usefully, diagrams that lied. On the rail beneath the framed map, a grandmother printed, "I stopped saying careful," and slid the paper into brass with the ceremony of someone laying down arms. Lucas drifted in with a card. Its bone-white edges were softened by too many pockets. He stood under the frame, set the card on the small shelf, wrote Day 1 on a sticky note with his tongue caught between his teeth for the hard corners, and smoothed it down, as if ironing a shirt he wanted to fit better next time. "Cards open doors," he said. He didn't look at anyone when he said it. "Then you have to do something," and he walked back toward the hall, where cones waited for nobody in particular, and Diana blinked at the world until it stopped being blurry, and put a label on a box that simply read, "Kept." Politics tried again in a better suit. A staffer called to suggest a ribbon cutting with speeches and flags. Winters sent over the media protocol, the wristband policy, and a polite line that said the class starts at 4 and we open by moving. Then set her phone face down on a clipboard and let it buzz itself tired. A neighbor posted about parking. A stranger wrote "scam" under a photo of a child's hand counting on a thigh. Parents arrived anyway with lunches and wipes and stories folded into tote bags. And the building, now practiced, welcomed them with climate and light and a rectangle of sun on the floor that shifted an inch each hour, like a clock that refused to shout. Costs kept finding new names. A contractor wanted change order money for a mistake made by his tape. Winters swapped him for another with a handshake that belonged in a colder novel, and told Richard later, "I like rules that deserve me." And he believed her enough to stop offering to carry her clipboard. She handed him a letter that afternoon. Foundation letterhead. Language that didn't stumble. "I'm applying," it said without saying, "quit director of operations here. If the position exists." And Diana leaned in the doorway and stared at the ceiling, so she wouldn't interrupt the sound of a life walking across a threshold it had been measuring for years. "It's a pay cut," Richard said. "It's a pay shift," Winters said. "From money to meaning." And it didn't land like a slogan. It landed like inventory. And he nodded, because his eyes had finally learned to tell the difference between charity and choice. Not everything argued. The bakery on the corner volunteered third Saturdays. Teenagers asked for wall space. A mother brought in a stack of old towels, clean as summer, and wrote on the rail in small, neat letters, "I am learning to clap later," and her son, unconcerned with literature, practiced turning left, until the left understood. A quiet moment arrived near close. Dust held briefly in a column of late light, and then gave up. Richard stood beneath the square on the floor and let his breath do that little work it had learned to do around rooms that didn't need him. Inhale on 1, hold on 2, let go on 3, and watch the rectangle crawl toward the far wall, as if the building were measuring itself against the day. He found Lucas at the tape. They didn't say much. "Three's still dumb," the boy muttered, dry as old chalk. And Richard smiled the you-win kind of smile and said, "Hate it all you want." And Lucas stepped anyway. Small defiance turned into forward motion without witnesses. Behind them, Diana locked the box. She pressed the lid with her palm and listened for the honest click. On the wall, a new slip waited. "I did not apologize for standing weird," and she left it without straightening the corner. The tilt, a reminder that balance lives inside bodies, not on paper. Night gathered at the windows. The building shed its heat in slow, friendly breaths. In the archive room, the bone-white card caught a square of streetlight and looked for a second like a window pretending to be a door. And the sticky note beneath it kept its simple promise without asking for applause. Steady as a pulse that had learned how to count and what to count for 1, 2, 3. A year put frames on the lobby wall. 3 cities stared back: Cleveland, Atlanta, Sacramento, each with a strip of tape and a date like a heartbeat. Beneath them, a 4th frame waited with nothing but a penciled word, "Next," and the morning laid a clean rectangle on the floor, as if light had been keeping score while nobody was watching. Parents queued at the desk with pens between teeth. Coats hung low on forearms. Coffee lids clicked. Small brothers bumped into big sisters. Kids came in at their own angles, chairs humming, braces tapping, sneakers refusing to whisper, and the air carried lemon, rubber, and the metallic ghost of last night's mop. Diana slid a box onto the archive shelf. The plaque from last week's gala rode inside, heavy as a promise. She'd said thank you into chandeliers and cameras, and now the award sat under a label typed in Winter's hand, "Kept for tax purposes," as if celebration were only useful when it helped keep the lights on. Richard used the side door and saved the hinge. He paused under the frames and read the tape notes like prayers. His morning held a meeting with a developer who used Activate like a spell, and after that, a coalition session about crosswalk timing, and in between, he wanted 10 minutes of quiet, where the building told him what not to do. Budget check, Winters said, steering a cart of clipboards. We're thin on Sacramento if we have to lease a storefront. She didn't slow, but he matched her speed, and she said the part she cared about first. The floor stays forgiving, and he nodded like a man who'd been taught where to cut and where never. Coalition at 2. She added, I printed the map with the parcels red, not beige. He smiled. She didn't need his approval, and the cart moved on like a small boat that had learned which current to trust. Lucas stood by the tape with a kid who couldn't look at the room yet. He drew 3 dots on his thigh with a marker and capped it. We breathe on these, he said, not whispering, not performing one small dot for in, one for hold, one for the number that scares you, and the boy nodded like a person signing a contract no adult would ever see. Dr. Mercer arrived with printouts and 2 graduate assistants. Her cane kept truth in time. Her notes wore angry arrows and soft stars. Visualization honest. She told the taller assistant, no heat maps that make parents feel like stock charts. If the outcome doesn't show up in a kitchen or on a playground, it's vanity. The assistant blushed and smiled. I'm learning, he said, which had become the building's second language. Good, she said, not letting him off, and pointed with the cane tip to the corner of a graph like she was poking a misbehaving dog. The reporter from the local paper returned without her camera. She'd written a summer story that refused to die in print. Mind if I sit and watch? She asked Diana, who waved her toward the archive and said, read the failures first. And the woman disappeared among boxes, labeled with merciless honesty, and came out blinking, like someone who'd been underwater longer than they planned. A boy sobbed the useful kind in the main hall. He wanted Left to behave. Left didn't. A staffer drifted close with a tissue, and a body angled to mean, I'm here if you want me. And nobody offered consolation that would take away the desire to try again, because this place had learned the difference between comforting and erasing. Richard checked his watch and didn't leave yet. He watched Lucas count under breath and place a foot like a treaty. The shy boy followed the count, 1 beat late and landed. Crooked, but his, and a grandmother at the rail pressed a slip into brass. I stopped saying, careful. He stopped saying, sorry, neat letters, weighted by time. The developer's suit matched the weather, steel gray. Lovely, unbothered by consequence. He spread renderings on a table and talked street art like wallpaper. Artisan kiosks, shaped like excuses, and how activation would lift all boats without noticing which houses were tied to the docks. No, Richard said, and surprised no one. He used the voice he'd learned here, the one that traveled without drawing blood. We're funding shade, parks, and a bodega that knows 3 languages. You can activate the crosswalk timing and then leave the rest alone. And the man laughed like he'd found an old toy in a drawer and put his pages away too carefully. You'll regret it, the developer said. It's a missed opportunity. I'm building what this building needs around it, Richard said, not a brochure, and he left the word hanging to do its work after he stood up, because some arguments only breathe once you've walked out of the room. He stopped by the archive before the coalition meeting. Breath and paper lived there in decent harmony. On the rail, a new slip read, First try. I named the fear in a child's handwriting, working hard at straight lines, and he stared at it a second longer than he meant to, then slipped his phone back into his pocket without photographing what wasn't his. 2 o'clock put him in a church basement, folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, flyers taped slightly crooked. The coalition leader, whose rage ran in fluent budget, slid a map across to him and said, we want money for timing lights at the corner, trees on the south side, and a curb cut at Elm that hasn't met the century yet. Yes, he said. He didn't suggest press. He didn't suggest anything besides checks and staying quiet in the minutes where people who live here told him what they needed. And when someone said, "We heard your developer meeting went cute," he said, "I prefer small plans that arrive." Back at the center, the afternoon had softened. The rectangle of light had inched along the floor and now lay half over the tape. Diana was in the lab showing a parent how sensors behave when they're not stealing attention, and Winters nudged a donor away from the entrance with the smile that sent banners to Hall B without denting egos. "Another award, Doctor," Mercer asked Diana dryly. "If I accept one more, you catalog your own failures on camera." "Deal," Diana said, not missing a beat, and they both grinned like people who had learned to laugh without undoing the work. In the quiet room, a kid traced his name on fogged glass. His finger squeaked once, then didn't. A volunteer stacked books with their spines out monkeys. Machines. Kids like these kids, and the building breathed the kind of breath that tells you you're in the right place without needing to be dramatic about it. Winters intercepted Richard near the office. "Sacramento landlord wants a logo wall," she said. "Send him a photo of the quarterly report," he said, "and a kind note about how the entrance belongs to the work," and she nodded, already forwarding the correct email with an attachment named "No" that opened into a paragraph anyone could survive. Lucas limped in his easy way. Sweat made a star at his collarbone. "Coach says my keep away looks like I'm cheating the angle," he said. "Deadpan," Richard said. "Angles don't have feeling." And Lucas half smiled and asked, "You watch without helping," and got, "I can follow," which had become a real sentence. They walked the main hall. Feet squeaked. A chair sang a high, bright note on a turn. A mother knotted her scarf badly and nobody fixed it for her. And the square of light on the floor kept moving like a clock that understood patience better than any wristwatch. A reporter intercepted. "Still open to a long piece?" she asked Diana, returning her notebook to her back pocket. "Write it after a month of watching," Diana said. "Or you'll write a profile, and we need a record." And the woman nodded, as if the paper had learned a new beat. The day pivoted small. The shy boy who hated 3 stood beside Lucas again. He set his foot on the tape and didn't move, then did, and the room exhaled. And Richard felt that old itch to clap early and kept his hands in his pockets where they belonged. The coalition meeting spilled back into the building in texts. Winters flashed a thumbs up. Then real news. "Lights funded. Trees next," she said, dropping her voice like it mattered only as much as it needed to. And Richard thought about how some victories earn whispering, because shouting would turn them into something else. Evening flirted with the windows. The light rectangle thinned and went gold at the edges. Diana stood under it with a mop handle in her palm. Not cleaning, just balancing it upright in 2 fingers, like a trick you do for yourself before you turn the key. "Do the frames feel right?" she asked, nodding toward the lobby wall. "They're a little crooked," he said. "On purpose," she said, and he looked again and saw intention where he'd first seen error, and felt the small tug of humility he had learned to follow until it offered something worth keeping. "Doctor." Mercer herded the graduate assistants past them. "Remember," she said, tapping her cane, "rooms teach when built well, and to the shorter one, models should be gentle, and to the taller, get to the part where a parent understands it without wanting to cry." And the boys nodded like they'd been handed a map instead of a scolding. The last class filtered out high fives, forgotten water bottles, the ritual hunt for a missing hoodie. A grandmother rapped the archive rail with a knuckle and slid in one more slip. I trusted him to try without me, then patted the brass like it had done something complicated. Richard stood under the window and did his quiet math. Inhale on 1, hold on 2, let it go on 3. Across the room, Lucas set his cane against the wall, planted both feet, like arguments he no longer needed to win, and helped the new kid draw 3 dots with 2 hands that almost didn't shake. "Tomorrow we mess up again." Lucas said, dry. The kid nodded, like he'd earned that kind of sentence. Diana turned off the music and let the room keep the kind of silence that has utility, not awe, the kind you can carry in your pocket into places that didn't plan for you. They walked out through the lobby. Frames glinted. The empty one kept its pencil word. Winters checked the lockbox and waited for the click she liked. And Dr. Mercer pressed a palm to the wall like a blessing she didn't believe in, but had learned to perform for buildings that kept their end of the bargain. See you tomorrow, Richard said. He didn't touch Lucas's shoulder. The boy bumped him with a grin that had grown up some and said, count me in. And Richard didn't answer, because some replies live better in the chest than in the mouth. He stepped into the soft night. Streetlight drew a second rectangle on the lobby floor. Behind the glass, the bone-white card under the frame caught it for a breath, a door pretending to be a window, while the building held the day's heat a little longer than it needed to steady. Practiced, patient, carrying the simplest rhythm into the dark. 1, 2, 3.